Well, thank you all for joining at this wonderful event. I'm so glad that you could all join us today. My name is Jean-Pierre Isbouts. I'm the editor of Fielding University Press, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this national Facebook Live event on the topic of colorism and the way this phenomena continues to torment our modern society, not just here in North America, but around the world. What we're going to do in the next hour is we're going to be talking with a wonderful person that I've had the great privilege of working with these last 12 months, I think it's been, Professor Kamala Woodson, and two of her co-authors who wrote this groundbreaking book, Colorism, Investigating a Global Phenomenon, which tackles this subject in depth in a way that I don't think any book has done before, particularly because it gives a broad overview of all the roots and manifestations of colorism in modern society, not only, again, in North America, but around the world. Now, just a few housekeeping issues before we get started. I would like to invite you to post any questions you have as we go through this session in the comments section of Facebook. So please don't hesitate if a question pops up, please put that in there. We have my colleagues monitoring that section, and when we get to the Q&A, which should be about 20 or 30 minutes into this program, we're going to address your questions. So please do not hesitate to post your questions in the comments section of Facebook. We also have a bit of a game. You can actually win a prize, believe it or not. We are giving away 3 copies of this wonderful book. To enter in the competition, all you need to do is to post, once again, in the section of Facebook, post what city or state that you are tuning in from on the Fielding Facebook timeline. And you will be automatically entered to win. So just enter your city or state in Fielding's Facebook timeline, and we will keep track of that. And you can do it at any time for the next 45 minutes. So until 7:45 Eastern or 4:45 Pacific or anywhere in between. And then we will announce the winners before the end of this session. Now, before I start with turning it over to Professor Kamala Woodson, I would like to recognize our provost, Dr. Monique Snowden, who has joined us for this session. Monique is the provost of Fielding Graduate University, and I was wondering, Monique, if you'd like to say just a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Jean-Pierre. So I wanted to bring everyone greetings on behalf of our president, Dr. Katrina Rogers. Unfortunately, she had a conflict and was unable to be here to welcome you to this wonderful live Facebook event. I want to thank Dr. Woodson and our distinguished authors here who contributed to this groundbreaking book. And particularly, I wanted to call attention to the sort of the subtext of the book, the implications for research, policy, and practice. I think that there are a number of wonderful chapters in this book, and I'm looking forward to hearing our panel talk today. And I would encourage everyone to make sure that they go ahead and follow Jean-Pierre's instructions there, because after you hear what Dr. Woodson and them have to say today, I'm sure you're going to want to win one of those complimentary copies of the book. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it back to you, Jean-Pierre, and Dr. Woodson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Snowden, our provost. The other person I would like to recognize, I'm not sure if he is already on or not, is Dr. Orlando Taylor, who is the Executive Vice President at Fielding Graduate University. And he is actually the one who introduced Kamala to us and her wonderful idea to write a book about colorism. So Orlando, whether you're on or not, or whether you're watching the recording, we owe you a debt of gratitude for introducing this wonderful book to us. So let me just very briefly tell you what it's all about and why we wanted to have this event today. I don't need to tell you that the incredible transformation that our society has experienced in this really grueling year of 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, so many things happening with police abuse. And so, of course, the book started well before we knew that these things were going to happen. And I think that's why the book is so incredibly timely, because it provides insights into the historical, the social, the cultural, and the personal challenges of people of color, African Americans, but also those with Latino or Indian and Asian ancestry. And I don't think there has ever been a book that takes such a comprehensive view. We have over 42 different authors from more than 15 universities and colleges in the United States that contributed to this wonderful book. And Dr. Woodson is going to tell us a lot more about that in a minute. And I think what is so unique about this book is that it looks at colorism not only as a phenomenon between different social groups, but also within one's own ethnic group. And so the objective of this book is to really provide a comprehensive reference on the history, the scope, the trends, and the implications of colorism. And as such, I think it's a wonderful book for every person in North America or around the world who wants to understand the underlying roots of colorism. But also, it could be a wonderful textbook in the classroom, at the high school level, at the college level, at the graduate level. This is really a book that should be on the bibliography of any class devoted to social justice in this country and beyond. So it is my great, great pleasure to introduce to you the woman scholar who has lived, worked, breathed this book for the last 2 years, ever since we first got to talk to one another. And that is Dr. Kamala Woodson, the editor of this book. Go ahead, Kamala. You have to unmute your audio.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre. I am very pleased to be here. I can appreciate the culmination of all of the work of all the authors that participated in this project. But I guess I'll just start off kind of giving you a sense of the impetus for it, kind of where it came from. I attended graduate school many years ago. And during that time, I was, as a clinical psychologist, I was trying to kind of redefine self-esteem and be thoughtful about self-concept. Because when I was in doing quantitative research, I recognized that many of the psychological tests that measure self-esteem were not comprehensive or sensitive enough to get at the subtleties that exist with regard to colorism and its impact. And so as I have kind of worked through my career, I've kind of understood that it's much larger than our literature even allows it to kind of exist. And so this volume was an attempt at redefining colorism, at bringing it into this century and kind of recognizing its importance throughout the world. And so one of the book itself kind of hinges on the concept that colorism has evolved and requires some reconceptualization. For example, when we talk about colorism, there's the idea that it's about skin color and skin color only. But as we know, as scholars and clinicians, that when you see someone, you don't only notice their skin color. And so what has kind of come bore out of this is that colorism has many facets. It can be your skin color, it could be your physique, it could be your hair texture, it could be your facial features. And so the idea is that there is some preferential treatment for those particular physiological traits that are commiserate with those of Caucasian ancestry or European ancestry, and that those are what are valued in our society. And so it was, pretty interesting to kind of think about it from the perspective of Africans in America and Africans throughout the diaspora. But what I recognized kind of through the years is that it's also an issue in Asian cultures and South America, and across most groups of color. And so that was one of the reasons for kind of bringing these scholars together to kind of redefine colorism. Another was to kind of redefine it, talk about its global footprint, and then to kind of think about it from a developmental perspective, like how does this come about? In the age of our growing racial tensions, police brutality, we're talking about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. Colorism is like a cousin of racism, and it's incessant and it's there, but often we don't talk about it. And so the book also kind of speaks to a developmental perspective, and so that we can kind of understand, how does this develop? And so as you think about colorism, and it being kind of a cousin to racism, if you think about that there are racist ideologies, there are also colorist ideologies. And so that was one thing. And then the last kind of, major point of the volume was to talk about it contextually. So this occurs in academic environments, in the workplace, in the media, in social media, in our law system, with regard to health disparities. And so there's some preferential treatment based on these phenotypic features that some people just that we don't necessarily attend to, and that we don't often talk about. And so again, it's kind of been, almost like my life's work in terms of redefining, being thoughtful about this. I'm in the process of developing a scale so that it can be measured and we can look at things empirically, and to then have some evidence-based interventions that can be developed. So Provost Snowden kind of talked about the implications for policy, practice, and research. That's exactly kind of where I'd like to kind of take this work from there, to do more empirical work and be able to measure colorism in a way that we haven't been able to do so thus far. One other piece that I will add before I will allow one of my co-authors to kind of talk is that another place that colorism gets perpetuated is in religion. And so I thought that, oh my gosh, this is another opportunity to kind of speak to the various ways that this gets reinforced and socialized in our way of thinking and being and even worshiping. And so I'm going to invite our colleague, Dr. Ronald Hobson, who is a professor at Howard University in clinical psychology and in divinity, to kind of talk about colorism and it's how it kind of manifests itself in religious contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Woodson. Am I on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Well, first, let me say how happy and privileged I am to have been a part of this volume, this groundbreaking volume, and it offered an opportunity for me to think about this issue in a way that, frankly, I hadn't until talking extensively to you, Dr. Woodson, and doing work on this. So my chapter is entitled The Color of Sin. And what I try to do in my chapter is to draw the connections between, as you were saying, Dr. Woodson, the reinforcement of negativity around Blackness, the reinforcement by religion of the negativity around Blackness. And I open the chapter with two citations from Scripture, one from the Hebrew Bible, what is Christians refer to as the Old Testament, and then the other from the Christian scriptures called the Gospels. And in both of these, I'll just read them as the context for what I try to illuminate in my chapter. From the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon in the Hebrew Bible, it reads, "I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept. And then in the book of John, in the Gospels, it says, and this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. So there you see already in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as in the Christian scriptures, the problematic of Black. Blackness is negative, Blackness is inferior, Blackness is the root of evil. And then I opened the chapter proper with the quotation of a favorite hymn from the Black church. Actually, it is a hymn that is often sung at communion services. It is entitled Nothing But the Blood. And the chorus of the hymn, the refrain is, "Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other font I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus." And I just want to offer the picture of a Black church full of Black folks heartily singing at the top of their lungs, "Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow." That's the power of the negativity of Blackness rooted in religion. And I go on in the chapter to trace the early ideas around Blackness as negative, even coming from church fathers in the 3rd and 4th centuries, even as the faith was getting seeded and consolidated in the Roman Empire, and then, of course, later around the world. And I developed this understanding of how darkness and Blackness became synonymous with sin and evil. And then if we then move to the way in which the Christian faith was taken up by the formerly enslaved and by the slavers themselves, then this Blackness and the negativity around Blackness continued to be reinforced. Blackness became the root of evil and of bodily obsession and danger and lack of discipline, and the Black body was considered negative and a threat. And even Christian preachers wrote apologies for slavery. And in those apologies, they often insisted that the Black person had to be tamed or corralled because the Black body was naturally one that would get out of control. And indeed, unfortunately, even though I teach at Howard University, ironically, one of the first 3 departments that founded the university was the Department of Religion, and it was the Department of Religion and Hygiene for the uplift of the formerly enslaved. And so the idea was, even as those were liberated, they needed to be taught to take care of the body because the body was dangerous. So I continue and looking in the chapter at the history of the negation of Blackness, and I look at the turn of the last century and the rise of fundamentalist religion and the ideas of Satan and Blackness as evil, of course, and the ideas of whiteness as being virtuous and ideal, and how that was taken up in the middle part of the last century, even by such Christian luminaries as Billy Graham, who was on a crusade to slow down the progress of the civil rights movement. He counseled Dr. King to go slower and to be more patient. And he himself conducted segregated crusades. The first part of Billy Graham's ministry, he conducted segregated crusades in the South, and they reduced religion to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, and any concerns with social justice were muted in the middle part of the last century as defining of Christianity. Then I trace in the chapter a move to the first efforts to redeem Blackness when the Black church revolted in the person of Dr. King and began to actually decry social injustices and to argue that Blackness was beautiful as whiteness is beautiful. And Dr. King began to argue that the Christian faith necessitated the work of civil rights and the civil justice and social justice. Now, the Black church wasn't initially on board with Dr. King. And so I covered that work and the splitting of the Baptist Church into the National Progressive Baptist Convention and the National Baptist Convention, precisely around the issue of the appropriateness of Dr. King's efforts at civil rights as fundamental to Christianity. So I traced that and how the work of these Black religionists was to rescue Blackness from being considered negative in the church and to begin to turn the corner on opening up the Christian faith to a faith that would advocate for social justice and not participate in the denigration of Blackness. Now, during the civil rights time, it's also important to remember, and I cover in the chapter, that there was a resurrection, if you will, of fundamentalist white evangelical Christianity that was provoked by the neoconservatives of the 1960s and 70s who were working against the progress of civil rights and utilized the white Southern church to induce in them a negation of civil rights concerns and social justice. They did this primarily around the issues of depicting the Black body as undisciplined and rapacious and overly sexualized, and the attitudes toward abortion and towards welfare and towards support for the families became synonymous with controlling the Black body. The famous Ronald Reagan's famous welfare queen, and then George H.W. Bush's famous use of William Lynch, whose name was William Lynch, not Willie Lynch, but the Bush team changed his name to Willie Lynch and depicted this Black man who had been released from prison and had raped a white woman. And so the efforts to re-inscribe negativity around Blackness were in full sway in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that the religionists were used by the secular neoconservative right-wingers to buttress their resistance to civil rights. I then move into how in the academy, as Dr. Woodson pointed out, there were efforts to rescue Blackness from negativity. The revolution in theology that was introduced by Dr. James Cone and Black theology argued that God was a God of the oppressed. And even as early as 100 years ago, there was an argument that God was Black, that God was on the side of the Black man because God was on the side of every oppressed group. And God, of course, had freed the Hebrews from enslavement in Egypt, and God was always on the side of the oppressed. So I come toward the close of the chapter by arguing for the efforts that have been mounted in the academy, and then trying to filter into the Black church again to rescue Blackness from negativity, finally exemplified primarily by the womanist theologians who came along and began to argue that it was important to affirm the Black body and the Black female body and the Black male body, and even to push back against notions of crucifixion and the death of a body as being necessary for salvation. So the Black feminist theologians, the Black women scholars that were called womanists, began to argue that in fact, the body as exemplified in Blackness and whiteness is sacred and precious and not a threat and wretched. And because Blackness is always associated with excessive embodiment, these Black womanists were trying to rescue the Black body and argue that the Black body is precious because the body is precious and the body needn't die for salvation to be effected. And so I end the chapter by arguing that there's been a real effort in religion to push back against the depictions that are ancient of Blackness as bad, and that this is not a necessary equation, and that hell is not Black and sin is not Black and the devil is not Black. And in fact, that all of these ideas far transcend color, and it's time to reinscribe Blackness as legitimate along with every other hue in the right to be well regarded and to be fully human.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hobson. That's a wonderful. I have a few questions for you, but I'll wait till the Q&A section. I want to remind everyone who is tuning in that if you have questions for our panel, to please enter those in the Facebook comment area. And if you would like to be included in our special game, if you put in your city and state in the fielding timeline on our Facebook page. If you just put in your city and state where you are joining us from, you will be entered into a special raffle for 3 free copies of Colorism. Camilla, I think at this point we would like to hear from Josephine. Would you agree?
Yes, yes, yes. I think Dr. Almanzar brings another rich piece to this discussion. So Dr. Hobson talked about religion and how religion kind of maintains these ideologies. And so if we think about the way that religion kind of transcends across race, then it makes sense that it would impact the Latino culture as well. So I invite Dr. Almanzar to talk about the Latinx population and how colorism manifests there as well.
Yes, hi, can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect, hi. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I wanna shout out Dr. Patricia Dixon, who worked next to me on this project and in this chapter. So as we've talked about, colorism is truly insidious and it plays a role in all aspects of our experiences. And it is also borderless, it is boundless, and we see it across the diaspora. So particularly in Latin America, which I'll focus on and what the chapter is all about, is talking about Black Latinx individuals. And so in Latin America, we often see a clinging to the idea that colorism doesn't exist, that skin color does not play a role in your lived experience. But on the other hand, we find that there is a subscription to the hierarchy of colorism and skin color based on, focusing on your access to power and privilege and resource. We see that Latin America subscribes to that hierarchy. And that has been across time, dating back to colonialism. And so when we think about present day Latin America and the United States, what we've found that, what we found is that darker skinned Latinx individuals experience more disparities with economic, educational, employment, and health disparities in Latin America and in the United States compared to their lighter skinned counterparts. And we see a colorblind response to that. So instead of acknowledging colorism as an impact and playing a role in these disparities, we see that more often nations are looking to class as being the root of these issues. And we also see it with our beauty standards. So across the diaspora, we see that there is an anchoring of Eurocentric features and skin color being the reference point for beauty. And so growing up, I watched Miss Universe, and time again, I would see how fair-skinned women would be chosen to represent nations that were predominantly of darker skin color. And so with that, I began to wonder, what is the message being sent? What is the message being sent to our young people, especially Latinx individuals? And really it talks about how the reference point of being Eurocentrically driven. So if you are closer to being white, you're more desirable, you're more beautiful, you're more likely to attain status, more likely to have your voice amplified. And that plays a role on the psyche. And so we see how Latinx darker skinned individuals might use coping strategies to get closer and closer to this reference point. So skin bleaching practices, we see the avoidance of being in the sun, we see this negative narrative, internalized narrative about our hair, and curly hair is undone, it's unnatural, it's not done unless you straighten it or you relax it or what have you. So the closer and closer that we get to that Eurocentric reference point, the more likely that you are worthwhile. And that plays a huge role on your psychological development. And some studies have found that in Latinx individuals living in the United States, that they're more likely to be socialized ethnically rather than racially. So what this means is that at an early age, Latinx children are being taught about their ethnic identity. So, you're Dominican, you are Puerto Rican, you are Mexican, Ecuadorian, and this is what it means to be from this nationality. These are the cultural values or the societal norms that come with that. But there's little emphasis on racial socialization. And with that, it's also talking about your skin color and what it means to be in the skin that you're in. What does it mean to be the way that you look? So with curly hair or with a certain type of physique. And that plays a role when it comes to racial preparation. So regardless of whether we talk about race growing up to our children, they're still going to face a world where race and skin color matter. And so they're facing this world not equipped to cope with colorism and not being able to identify those experiences. So although they feel pain and they're like, oh my gosh, that was such a painful and awkward experience, the way that this kid talked to me or the way that this adult spoke to me or interacted with me, it's hard for them to identify it because they haven't had that racial socialization and being able to talk to from an early age what it means to be in their skin color. And with that, they have less resources to cope with colorism, and they have less resources, internal resources to advocate for themselves and to speak and defend themselves. And so when it comes to interventions, really focusing on the developmental perspective. So really taking a look at how do we talk about skin color to our children? How do we talk about, what does skin color mean in the society, what it meant before, what it means now, and what it could mean. And then once we're able to identify what skin color means in one's life, then we're able to redefine it. Because up until now, skin color has been defined by white supremacy and by our Eurocentric, again, reference point. And so when we begin to first have the conversation about it, then we can begin to cultivate our own definition and recalibrate our own internal compass and create our own narrative, essentially, when it comes to skin color. So colorism impacts the diaspora all across the way. And it's really important for us to begin to have these conversations. And I think that this book does that beautifully, where it not only talks about colorism from the United States and how that's experienced, but also around the world. And I think it's a very validating experience to read that and to read the literature and to recognize that, wow, this happens all across the world. I'm not alone in this experience. And when you feel that validation, you're much able to feel empowered to do something about it. And as we know, colorism is something that is done to us. It's not something that is our fault, our problem. So it's not our skin color that is the problem. It's the messages that we've been instilled that is the issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Almazar. That was a beautiful presentation. And I would like to sort of take the first step in our Q&A section. I know we have a number of questions flowing into the chat box, but if you will permit me, I would like to ask a question to each three of you in response to your wonderful presentation. And first to Dr. Woodson. When I got your manuscript the first time, I was blown away because, as in your proposal, you said, well, I'm going to get at least 40 scholars from so many universities. And we do a lot of books that have big ambitions. And in the end of the day, maybe half of the people who said they would contribute. But you did it. You brought so many different perspectives from more than 15 colleges and universities together. And my question is, how the heck did you do that? I mean, how were you able to energize so many people to contribute to this book?
Well, I think the topic is very timely. And I think that my contributors really recognize the importance of advancing the literature in this way. And so I was able to, I literally have 3 or 4 more chapters that just didn't make it. And people saying, where is volume 2 coming? So it's very important. It's conversations that as people of color can be very painful, and we tend not to have them. And so the scholars that decided to participate were had such vigor and excitement about it because it's very necessary in the literature.
Thank you so much. And I must say that some of the people who read the book have told me that what they find so striking about the book is not only its scholarship, the scholarship is beyond question, and the depth of studies that are cited, but also its accessibility. The book is accessible. It's not written for academics. It's not written for specialists. This is something that everyone can be immersed in and be inspired by. So that is a great compliment that I wanted to to bring over to you and your co-authors. Of course, Dr. Hobson, you touched on the subject that's very dear to my heart. As you know, I've written a number of books for National Geographic about religion. And what you said about the color, the color association of Jesus is so incredibly important. You know, in my book, in my first book, The Biblical World, I actually used a forensic study by a group of British anthropologists who used the skull from northern Judea to reconstruct what Jesus would have looked like in real life. And he was a dark-skinned man. He was a black man, as many other people in the Middle East are today. And what I try to do is trace the development to the white Jesus. Basically, what happened is that concept traveled into Asia Minor, which was, of course, the era of the Roman Empire. And the very first depictions of Jesus depict him as a philosopher in a toga, as a Roman or a Greek sage. And that's, of course, where that whole process started. But what I found so important, what you said, is that Jesus is, the Gospels are about social justice. It's certainly important that the Gospels can inspire us for self-fulfillment, for self-realization, the idea of being reborn, but we should never forget that the essence of the kingdom of God theology is about saving the oppressed. And what I find in my own church, as well as in other churches, that sometimes that message is lost in the theology and the doctrine. The essential concept of the kingdom of God is to redeem the oppressed wherever they may live, whatever their skin color. And I'm so grateful to you for emphasizing that in your chapter. It's not really a question, it's just a statement of deep appreciation.
Yes, that's exactly it. That is not known and understood, even though it's in black and white on the pages, but it's lost in the way we socialize people in the religion.
I got a lot of flack for using that picture of the Black Jesus in the book, but I think things are changing. I think this book was published 50 years ago, but I think things are really changing. Okay, we have a lot of comments coming in, but I have one more question for Dr. Almazar before we go into the questions from other people on this call. And that is that what I find so striking is the international scope of what you wrote and what other folks wrote. For example, the chapters on India, colorism in India, blew me away. I had no idea that colorism is so incredibly prevalent in Indian society, but also in Latin America. Where do you see the key differences between colorism in Latin America and in our society?
I think it boils down to, in Latin America, there's a lack of conversation and recognition of race. So there's this belief that we are all racially mixed people, race doesn't really exist, we're this utopia. And so there's no talks about race and colorism and how that plays a role in our lived experiences, compared to the United States, where there's this vivid racial order where we can recognize and talk about race much more openly. And although there's some hesitation, there's just much more on the surface when we talk about race, white, Black, et cetera. So I think that's the main difference, and that's what holds Latin America back in being able to have healing when it comes to the impacts of racism and colorism in its society, and being able to fully celebrate and acknowledge the history, the beautiful history of African descent in Latin America, because you can be ethnically Latinx and Black, you can be both. The pan-ethnic label of Latinx does not encompass race. And so that is something that we need to begin to unlearn, because that is something that was instilled in us and not something that is helpful for us to grow.
And of course, that's an outcome of the colonial history in those
Yes.
places, you know, the Portuguese in Brazil and the Spanish in other parts. And yeah, it's a fascinating subject, and your chapter is so illuminating on that subject. So many thanks to you for making that contribution. Now we should go to the growing list of questions that we are getting from our viewers. Here is the first question. Are there ideas on what types of literature should be integrated in ethnic studies or overall school curricula from K-12 to the higher education level in order to encourage greater openness about diverse readings and thought? Any ideas about literature that could help us in the classroom?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. There are several novels, that were written. Like, when I was in K through 12, I had to read Moby Dick. How about we read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison? So there are lists of books that kind of talk about race and color that I think from a literature perspective that could really begin to kind of start the conversation for younger people. But I do think, given our racial climate and the fact that we have Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee is setting the occasion for these kinds of conversations. Like she will say, I'm a Black woman, but the media may say, she is an Indian woman. And so the discourse around how people describe themselves ethnically, I think can also be helpful. So certainly, regular literature, Toni Morrison and various other writers. But if we just think about it, from our current racial climate, I think many lectures can come about with regard to race and racism and color and colorism.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodson. Also, I should add for all of the teachers, instructors who are on this call that each chapter of this book has questions, 5 or 6 questions after each chapter that can be used for to start a discussion at the community level, at the school level, K to 12, high school, college. So the book is really geared towards proactive use in whatever educational or social setting you may use it in. Let me go on to the next. The next question is more of a statement from my dear colleague, Dr. David Blake Willis. He says, in South India, it is the dark goddess and the dark gods that are virtuous and examples in society. And for example, he says the boogeyman, the devil in South India is white. So there are positive impulses to that. And of course, Dr. Willis is very well published in those studies. Thank you for that, David. There is another question from Corey Nevels about how do specific religions or how do certain people appropriate their religion as it relates to colorism? Dr. Hobson, would you be able to address that question?
Well, I wonder what is meant by appropriate their religion as relates to colorism. It's hard to know. The thing that comes to mind as perhaps a response to that, it may not get at what the questioner intended, but is the way in which the neoconservative movement in the 60s appropriated religion to their ends to convert the South from a Democratic stronghold to a Republican stronghold. And they did that by working with the white church in the South. And they use these dog whistles and sometimes foghorns, not just dog whistles, to sort of seduce and invite the white church to align with certain racially sensitive and racially oppressive policies by using their religion to do so. And so I don't know if that gets at the question of how it aligns with colorism, but that religion may align with colorism. But certainly all of the, as I referred to when I mentioned talked about my chapter, using those ideas, law and order and the ideas of disorder in the community and the disorder and the threat of the Black body, and of course coming off the '68 convention and the riots after the killing of Dr. King, and the depiction of the Black body is potentially out of control. And then white evangelicalism was personal piety, personal salvation, and asceticism and orderliness, and whiteness became the symbol of order and Blackness the symbol of disorder. So I don't know if that responds, but that would be my thinking take on that question.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it very much. Great response. Dr. Almazar, I would like to direct the next question to you. from Peggy Russell, which is an interesting question. It says, what effect has it had on you as authors to collaborate on this book? Has it had an impact on the way you see this phenomenon?
I think for me, going back to the word validation and how colorism is something that impacts every aspect of our lived experience. And we might see it through our own individual lens and note it, but when we see other people come together and recognize, wow, this is happening in all various parts of the world, in all various professions and across economic status and educational attainment, colorism does exist. And so throughout doing this work and working alongside my colleagues, I think for me, it's been the validation of knowing that this work is important, and it gives people the tools to begin to build their own self-identity, being able to give them the vocabulary to identify their experiences. That's what research is all about, is being able to help people understand that this is what's happening in the world, and being able to validate those experiences for other people is so important. So educating people, validating people, that is what this work is all about. And that's what I've gathered from it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Almazar. Dr. Woodson, what's next for you? I mean, you have published so much on this topic, and of course, this book has been the last 2 years of your life wrapped in the covers. What's next for you? It's an important, it actually follows up on what Dr. Almazar was saying. I mean, how can we move this phenomenon forward? How can we move the incredible momentum that we've achieved this year, particularly with the election of this new ticket, of the Biden ticket? How can we move this forward? What can we do as individuals?
Wow, that's a great question. So in terms of what my plans are, I would like to, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is create a scale. And that once I can create a colorism scale that then assesses colorism, then we can bring it into a therapeutic setting where if there's a colorism score, then clinicians can say, okay, you scored this on the score. This means this is an issue, and this is how we might address it. And so legitimizing it in the way that we do as social scientists, I think is important. I mean, we talk about it anecdotally, and we've been doing that for a while, and I think that's awesome. But I think for it to, unfortunately, have legitimacy in all circles, we need to make it the ability to have it empirically assessed, and then that will then inform the interventions that we do. And so in terms of what do we do about it, we continue to have conversations. I think the conversations should occur earlier. We talk, and across communities. So in the Black community, there's been like, after Black Lives Matter, there's been this conversation about the conversation. When do you have the conversation with your children about racism? I think we had to have the conversation with our children about colorism, and it not just children of color, but all children. And so that they understand kind of this implicit bias in how it can be impactful in bullying. But I also think that there's another piece that we don't talk about, and it's relative to people of Caucasian ancestry and their colorism, not just how they see people of color and maybe preferential treatment here or there, but how there's a tendency for Caucasian people to want to be like people of color. So you have tanning, you have physical augmentation with regard to, you know, physical features among women. And so the sadness of this all is that you have people of color who often try to approximate Eurocentric ways of presenting, and you have Caucasian people who try to approximate people of color ways of existing and being. And so it's like we love each other. And so if we can create some unity and some discourse around that beauty comes in all hues and shapes and sizes, and celebrate one another, I think we can have some healing. So that would be, you know, what I would suggest that we do, is to talk about it and kind of recognize that this is what's happening.
Are you hopeful?
Extremely.
Wonderful. That's great. I have another question coming in from, and I hope I pronounced the last name correctly, from D. Anderson Moore for Dr. Almazar. What kind of reactions have you gotten when discussing colorism with whites?
I've gotten various responses, and I'm going to peel it back to experience in the Latinx community. There's a mix of reactions. So a lot of it is resistance. And again, that goes back to colonialism, post-colonialism, where there was this encouragement of racial mixing in order to, over time, erase African and indigenous presence from Latin America. And so this clinging of racial mixing is this clinging to, oh, we're just all the same. That's, skin color doesn't really matter here. When you bring up colorism, some people understand it and some people don't. And some people usually find themselves feeling defensive because they think that they themselves do not perpetuate colorism, when in fact it happens without you even knowing. Your mere presence of being a white person in a room can create a dynamic where that might exist. And so being able to have these conversations recurrently with people is really important, because this is not an issue that is hard to digest for white folks, but also for people of darker skin as well. Being able to recognize that internal dialogue, again, is destructive, that we've absorbed from white supremacy and Eurocentric beliefs, that our darker skin, our phenotype is less worthwhile. So these are conversations that are not easy, but they're necessary, because without us knowing it, we might perpetuate colorism, or we might be absorbing it and internalizing it within ourselves.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. Dr. Hobson, we're coming to sort of the end of the session, but we're still getting questions in, so hopefully we can sneak this one in. This is a statement from Mary Ann Malone, and it's sort of a bit of a testimony. She says, I grew up in a predominantly African-American community. I've always appreciated my brown skin. And so I think because I grew up in a predominantly African-American community, I appreciate my natural hair. So has self-acceptance got a lot to do with this, you think?
I think it does have a lot to do with it. And I think that we, in both ways, I think the Black church has certainly facilitated the esteem and self-development of Black folks, members of the church. And at the same time, inadvertently, I think sometimes Black faith has also undermined the esteem and well-being of Black people. And both things can happen at the same time. We certainly, my earliest memories are proudly saying my Easter piece and standing up in front of the church when I was 6 years old and saying, and the esteem from the people who loved and cherished and embraced me for doing well. And at the same time, the notion of hell and Blackness is bad and the body is bad. Both those things coexisted. So I think that the church has certainly been a resource for good. And I think we need to keep pushing it to be more so.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the end of our session. I hope that all of those of you who are tuning in have enjoyed this conversation with the editor of Colorism, Dr. Kamala Woodson, and two of her authors, Josephine Almazar and Dr. Ronald Hobson. They are just two of more than 40 authors who contributed to this book called Colorism, published by Fielding University Press, and we're so proud that we were able to publish this work. We have a winner of our contest. We have three winners, which I should announce. Kyle McKent, Mohammed Alarja, and D. Anderson Moore are the three winners of our contest. So they will receive a copy of this wonderful book, Colorism. However, it is available from Amazon, both in printed form and in ebook form. I like to read books on my iPad, so you can choose between printed, and it's a big book. It's almost 400 pages. It's a wide 10:7 format. So if you prefer the electronic book, that's certainly available as well. with that, there are in the chat box, there are many, many wonderful comments from people saying, such great insights. Thank you for your comments. I'm excited to dig into this work. This is from Ignacio Vargas Ruiz. We have one from Lolly de Young saying, wonderful discussion. Thank you for participating. Many other comments from other people. So hopefully this has been an inspiring experience to participate in discussion. And once again, it's up to me together with our provost, Dr. Monique Snowden, to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for the wonderful work that you and your co-authors have done to bring us this wonderful work. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening if you're on the East Coast, and while it's getting dark here on the West Coast as well. Thank you so much for participating. And don't hesitate, if you read the book and have any comments, please let us know at Fielding University Press. My name is Jean-Pierre Isbouts, gisbouts@fielding.edu, or just simply write to Fielding Graduate University. And I hope in a few months to gather and do this again so we can see what impact have we had with this book. If you are game for that, Dr. Woodson, let's do it again in a few months, and hopefully in a new era next year under a new president and vice president. I think it would be wonderful to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.